So I'm firing up our small mill for the day, and this is now a daily activity, and I'm really excited about it. We started the spring this year with this goal of increasing access to specialty grains, and it's kind of interesting how various initiatives and projects tend to weave together, because we had this goal, and then we also decided on going to Portugal and baking with Anna. While there, we worked with a bunch of specialty grains. And that's probably because in Europe it's just more common to do so. I remember receiving the email from her on the recipes that she wanted to work on, and I immediately ordered one of the grains. This is actually buckwheat here. You can tell by its shape that it is not a grass. I'm actually going to compare and contrast, since I have a couple grass seeds, i.e. rye. So these are rye berries, and they grow like a grass. You can see they're kind of oval shape. If you look at wheat berries, they look a lot more similar to the rye, whereas these buckwheat seeds are actually called groats. What I'm going to do with the mill, first of all, I just want to mention that the first time I made this bread was actually in Portugal with Anna. And out of all the breads that we made, this one was the most goofy result. We had run out of time with the bulking bins. Actually, the baker that was helping us, Satkaram, had already been in his bakery that day for something like 16 hours, and we just decided, okay, well, these bulking doughs are taking too long. We're going to put them in the refrigerator overnight and just pick up where we leave off tomorrow morning. They definitely got a heavy bulk in that overnight period, and so we sort of lost control of the final fermentation of that dough. It still produced great bread, although it was a little bit more sour than we had hoped, and we didn't quite have a very good handle through and through because we let it go refrigerated for quite some time. So one of the other problems we experienced over there was the fact that our flour that we had found, the buckwheat flour, was unfortunately too fine. We couldn't find a whole lot of buckwheat flour in the area, and the little bit that we did find was a bit too fine. So you can see I've already milled some buckwheat here, and I've milled it to a much coarser setting. So I'm going to set this mock mill up to basically level 18. It goes 1 to 10, and then you can actually tighten it back up to loosen the stone even more and keep going. So it's segmented in ones, and so basically if 1 is the 2 stones barely touching, I've moved it to level 18 to mill this to mill these groats. And they're going to mill through very quickly because of how coarse I'm milling them. Meanwhile, I already have boiling water, so it's time to get this first part of this dough started. The various scalds that I've been working on were all sort of inspired by this recipe. I was hoping to build a base set of grain recipes that I could use to mill any wholemeal grain and follow a simple method that applied to multiple in my bakery. The thing about proof is that we now function in scale, so it's a little bit harder for us to justify making 12 breads of a certain kind. We have an entire team to support, and so we really have to think on small scales in terms of dozens at the very least, and really multiple dozens. So we don't have a whole lot of demand for these new loaves yet, and so I want to be able to make 12 or 16 at a time. And the way that I'm doing it is by pairing various grains together. So I'm preparing buckwheat here today, but I'm also preparing the other 2 scalds that we've been working on recently, meaning the rye scald and the Coruscant scald, at the same time. So now I'm taking half of the amount of buckwheat flour as I have to water and pouring it over this boiling water, which I actually inverted. I meant to put it in this this container, the Cambro, and instead I put it in my pot, which I'm actually supposed to be using to boil the next water. So, oh well, I'll quickly get this taken care of before the next scald is going. So that's just me goofing up. But now that I have the boiling water and the buckwheat groats, I can introduce this together, and the 2 times boiling water will easily absorb all of the grains that I'm introducing to it. Which otherwise, if you didn't do this in this way with boiling water, and you just tried to mix, say, buckwheat groats with water, a few things would happen. For one, you wouldn't get 2 times the water to absorb. You'd maybe get 50% of the flour in weight of water to absorb. So I'm able to get a lot more moisture into my dough by using the scald. But more importantly, and this is actually something that I learned in Europe while working with other bakers that use this technique more frequently, is that the scalding technique brings out a lot of flavor. So I can already smell the buckwheat as it's cooking in this scalding water. And this is Anna's recipe. I'm excited to take a closer look at this, for one, because the buckwheat bread that we made in Portugal was the one that we had sort of the least control over. And for two, it will highlight kind of the project that we were working on in greater detail. So one of the things she mentioned when we were working together was this fact that if you just added buckwheat to the whole wheat blend that we use for the rest of the bread, you wouldn't really taste the buckwheat in the final product. But by scalding it ahead of time, it brings all these flavors out, and so then the final loaf is just full of this flavor. It's quite abundant. What was really interesting to see when I returned home in my initial trials of this bread was that our customers preferred this bread to the rye and the Coruscant upon sampling all three. I thought that was interesting. Buckwheat is not so common in our area, so I really didn't know what to expect in terms of reception. But that was it. I'm going to go ahead and clean out this container, which should have never gotten dirty in the first place, and return so that we can move on. So while I'm completing this buckwheat scald, I'm going to go ahead and get the next one going. And in this way, what I'm actually really doing is introducing a whole new workflow to the bakery that involves milling fresh flour and preparing scalds. We currently don't have enough of a demand for fresh flour to afford a big mill or to employ somebody just to mill flour. But we're trying to be creative about it and merge some workflows. So I have the scalding process that I'm introducing from multiple wholemeal flours. As a result, I don't have to worry about pre-sifting the flours and trying to achieve finer flours. The scalding adds the benefit of being able to incorporate gently these otherwise very coarse whole grains. In fact, I milled this buckwheat coarse on purpose after the experience in Portugal where Anna was really hoping for a texture to come from this inclusion, and the fine buckwheat flour that we found locally at the store wasn't really up for that task of providing that texture. So this is the coarsest milling amongst all the various grains that I'm doing. Now for the next grain, I'm going to set this one aside. This buckwheat scald now has to cool all the way before we mix with it. And while it's cooling, I'm going to get the next grain started. Freshly milled rye flour that I milled just a little while ago today, this morning. And now it's scaled and ready for the next pot of boiling water. While I'm waiting on that water, I'm going to move on to the last of my current grains. also just recently milled, and that's the Coruscant. You can see it's yellow. And once you start using these grains on a daily basis like I have, it's very easy to differentiate between them, which I find to be sort of interesting. A lot of times people just think of flour as flour and all flour is the same. This is just a really nice way of discovering how different one grain can be from another, both in flavor, in texture, and in this case, even in the way that we're milling them. While I'm waiting on this pot of water, I'll demonstrate the difference in how to mill this Coruscant. So we'll replace some of the Coruscant that we've used here. And in order to mill the Coruscant, I'm now going to put the mill back into the finest setting. So I'm going to bring down the stones together to the point that they're starting to touch. That's the sound of the stones coming together. I'm just going to go a little bit over that so that they're not grinding so much. And now grab some Coruscant berries. You can really see the difference. The Coruscant is fine, although it's still milled whole. There's no sifting that's happened, so if I feel it between my fingertips, I can still feel a little bit of grittiness that comes from the outer layers of that berry. Now the buckwheat, on the other hand, is milled very coarse, so you can see here actually much larger chunks of grain, and so in the final dough those chunks remain, and it becomes more of like a multi-grain type loaf that you're familiar with, where the cracked grains add a little bit of toasted, grainy texture to each bite. Both are pleasant in different ways, but what's interesting is you have 3 different grains here that produce 3 different breads, and it's very easy to differentiate between them. You think, oh, same process, same scalding, same everything. Will these breads be distinct enough to appeal to different people, or why make all 3? Why not make one at a time when really the process is very similar? And what I found really interesting between the rye, the Coruscant, and the buckwheat in particular was the Coruscant added a really beautiful taste and texture to the crust, more so than the other grains in terms of crust quality and development. Whereas the buckwheat overall, because it was coarsely milled, added a really interesting flavor profile, but also a texture to the entire loaf. Each bite had that little grainy aspect to it that appealed to people that enjoy a little bit of nuanced texture in their bread. And then the rye adds a huge amount of flavor and is more familiar of a flavor set to people that are familiar with rye. So I really enjoyed the way these all played together. And we're actually sampling them at the bakery right now, all 3. So our customers can try each of these ancient grains and see which one they prefer and go ahead and grab them. That was also a takeaway from my time with Anna, where we were talking about sampling and how it was literally responsible for making her brand what it is today. They took a bakery that was in the basement of a fine food store, which wasn't really particularly branded, didn't focus necessarily on sourdough, and Anna's vision was ancient grains, long fermented processes, and highlighting the bread itself, letting it speak for itself. And so I introduced that in my bakery and have watched how people have really gravitated towards some of these new specialty grains that we're making just by being able to try them. So I'm waiting on this water to boil. I'm going to check back on it in just a minute or 2 so that we can get this process finished up and move on to mixing our buckwheat. So Logan's going to take this mix, which is kind of an interesting one. if you look through the last couple mixes of ancient grains that I've done, meaning the Coruscant and the rye, you saw me individually incorporate the various components. Here, we're working on scaling this up. So I mentioned why when we were doing the scalds, why I'm keeping these formulas consistent. And part of it is because, as you can see, our bakery is set up for bowls of this size or larger. We do have one smaller mixer, and using it is just as fast as using these. So we want to be creative and use our tools accordingly. So what we're actually going to do is prepare the exact same base dough for all three mixes, the buckwheat, the Coruscant, and the rye. And we're going to first incorporate all the other components of the dough, then treat the additional scald like an inclusion. We're going to fold it in on the top and then throw it back in the mixer for just a couple minutes to incorporate. This is something that Logan put together in testing, and so far we have very comparable results in the final product. So what it allows us to do, when we're only making 12 at a time, I'm not sure that it saves much time. But imagine if we were making 120 or 250. We could mix in our giant mixer, which can accommodate 250 loaves, cut out the base dough, add a scald in the smaller mixer, and finish up the process. So that's kind of our logic, is how do we do this artisan baking at our scale in a way that makes sense? So trying to figure that out. And this might not be the best answer yet, but it's the best answer that we have for now. And really at the end of the day, that's all that it's about. It's just incremental improvement with each batch. So far you've seen me do singular batches, and those are great for putting together a video like this. They're great for baking at home. They're great for baking at a small one-person bakery. But when it comes to feeding thousands of people like we do here at Proof, we're trying to take this to the next level. How can we freshly mill our own flours? How can we incorporate a variety of ancient grains? And yet, how can we do this in a way that's still efficient and allows us to keep the price of bread reasonable for our customers? So Logan's got his math, and he's going to take care of this mix.
Oh, this pen is horrible.
Here.
Thank you. Oh, it's like there's a new design function. These aprons are brand new, and I'm not used to having pockets or anything above a $5 Amazon apron, so.
Actually, we have this relationship with apron maker out of Colorado. I can never say their company name right. I think it's Valen Stitch. Please forgive me if that's incorrect.
I don't think that is. I don't think there's an S in there.
Oh, there's no S there?
No.
So there's no Stitch? Valentich? Anyway, we've been buying aprons from them, at least Amanda and I have, from the beginning. Our original garage crew, the first 4 employees, got these like really nice premium aprons. And then we went through the last few years of building our bakery, and aprons just were not a priority. But we've rewarded everybody who's been promoted here from the apprentice level, bakers, leads, and above, with these nice aprons. They just came in yesterday. So Logan has made it past the apprentice level at the very least.
Come on.
Except when it comes to calculating recipes.
It's hard. My phone is not my friend, really. All right, math complete. All right, so starting off, always just going for my liquids. All of our scales are also toast, so tare is not an existing function. You just have to turn it off and on and wait 10 or 15 seconds. So I'm just starting off pouring, measuring out my water. I need 4.995 kilos. We are not auto leasing this dough. Instead, I'm mixing all aspects of it that are not the actual scald into the mix first. I'm gonna scale that into a set of bins and then dimple and inclusion fold the way that we've done it on other videos in the past. John, you didn't get enough. This corner's tiny. Grabbing more starter. The starter is a little early. You can see that it still has a little more room to go, but it's getting close enough that it shouldn't make a big difference. So this starter was made at about 7 a.m. We like to give it about 6 hours, and it's getting close to about noon, so we're still a little early. But around this time, supplementing with just a little bit of slightly early starter shouldn't be an issue. This starter is very hot. It was done a little late, so it's well into the 100-degree range in terms of most of its lifespan here. So even though it's been in the fridge for about 40-45 minutes, it's still pretty hot. So it's going to be farther along than our normal 6-hour starter. I'm going to spray off real quick. Everyone around here really enjoys when people just leave starter all over the handles, you know. Trying to get yourself clean and then you just put your hand right into a pile of it. This is my wife Madison here and little baby Violet. Well, she's not a baby anymore, she's a toddler, but she's gonna sit here for right now. She's very shy all of a sudden. I'm just portioning starter in here. So last major wet ingredient aside from starter and water here is I'm gonna add my honey. It's a very liquid honey. Unusual if you get really high quality honey from a local apiarist. This stuff tends to be very crystallized right when you get it. Now, a little does go a long way with honey, given it's pretty much a sugar syrup. So, to prevent sticking to the bottom of the bowl, I found it very useful to sloshing it around in the bowl. Sounds bad, but it's really the only thing I can think of. Is if you're fancy, you can use a whisk, but I like to just get in there with my hand. You're just trying to prevent it from sticking directly to the bottom and instead kind of incorporating up into your water there. See, you just see globs of honey. If that ends up stuck to the bottom, you just end up with a big patch of honey sticking to all your flour, and then you, instead of mixing all your dough together, it just clumps up. So now it's time for dry ingredients. So I'm using a type 85 flour, which is about 0.85 ash. And before I go ahead and toss this in, I'm gonna get my flour in and then my salt on top, give it a little sifting. Salt's pretty good about incorporating into water. All right, this is not working for me. Incorporating salt into water typically isn't a big deal. It's unlike sugar, which likes to clump up when exposed to moisture. It does a good job incorporating, almost like a slurry. It's a similar thing with the honey though, is it quickly bouncing it around. I've always found it simpler if you just pour it in with your flour, quick sift, it's the same thing, but then you're also not covered in whatever else you poured in there. As a general rule of thumb, at baking at home or in large volume, it's a good idea to measure your salt into something else. It's really easy, especially at small scale, to overdo it on salt. I err on the wild side, so I just go right in, but because I end up with a little pile of salt. If I need to pinch it out, it's not a big deal. If you're just measuring 7 grams of salt, it's really easy to go to 15, and once you're in your flour, you either have to scoop out all your flour and start over, or deal with a very salty bread. So in terms of quickly hand sifting, all I did was this motion, and it's gone. It's all just mixed in with my flour here. There's enough that it's very, very quick and easy. And then I can pour on top of my wet ingredients here, and we're gonna get this mixing. Flour cloud. In the short term, this dough is gonna be very dry. You'll see it in a moment, but I'm gonna have to mix it on a slow speed for quite a long time to get it to actually incorporate all its ingredients. In some instances, it could be simpler to just grab a paddle attachment just for quick incorporation. It doesn't do a great job building gluten, but in the short term, we'll just go for the hook. All right, now that we're up, I'm just gonna set this to my second speed, just leave it alone for a few minutes. I'm a big fan of big, dull knives in here. It's like medieval conflicts. You're not trying to chip it on the sides of the bowl, but you also need it large enough that when you give it a swing, you can actually get some action. All right. Super simple. I'm gonna go ahead and get my scalds out of the fridge, get my first one in here, and then I'll start inclusion folding them into these guys. You'll notice there's a big difference in how these mix. The first one, where I'm just throwing it on top, ends up mixing very different compared to my next two here. Yesterday, when I was mixing these, I developed the gluten a lot further before adding these scalds. Lost my hook. Oh, here it is. So I'm curious to see how this goes. I'm just going for, on this mix, incorporation, and then adding the scald. So I'd like to think it's gonna go pretty smooth because it's gonna take a fair amount of time before I can actually get all of my scald incorporated. So should be plenty of time to get my mixing function complete. So I'm gonna start it off kind of slow at 2. If you take a look inside the bowl, you'll see the base dough is just swirling around, kind of just squishing the buckwheat scald. Not a big deal, that's a good thing. It just means it's gonna take some more time to mix, which is actually good for the base dough there, which, like I mentioned before, isn't super well developed. All right, so this is the rye in the bowl right here. It is fully mixed and ready to come out. I'm just scooping it out in one big blob into my oiled bin. I don't really care how it looks right now because it's going to relax into the bin, and then I can give it some more folds just like we would our sourdough. And then going in next, I've actually got the croissant here. I've already done the dimpling and folding in, so the croissant's actually layered in between here. Just tossing it in. They're going to get these doughs are going to get a series of stretch and folds, very similar to the rest of our breads, and then they're going to get shaped sometime this evening after they've gotten 3 of them and had proper fermentation time. Some of the scalds were a little colder than others, so they're going to get shaped a little later in the day than their warmer counterparts, but after they get shaped, they'll just end up in the fridge until they get baked off tomorrow morning.
So I'm baking actually all 3 of these new products. You can see the other 2 videos that we already made on croissant and rye, but I'm going to bake croissant, rye, and buckwheat all in the same deck. They're very similar compositions, just changing out the final grain. And so Emily's just finishing up sweeping the oven. We had to do a modification to our broom, which broke. So you can see that it's now extra long. Did you get her or no?
No, I almost got her.
Okay. So this is my buckwheat. I have let this have a final proof outside of the walk-in cooler for actually a few hours. It looks like it was shaped really young yesterday. And in the bannetons, it wasn't even consuming the length of the banneton when I pulled it out of the fridge. The reason I caught on to this was we actually baked off a few earlier this morning. And with our learning team, we're actually trying to create some of these redundancies where we'll bake a little bit in the morning, and that way people can start judging fermentation and seeing, oh, do the rest of the loaves need longer, or are they okay as they are? The key around here is how do we make everybody a better baker? How do we substitute the years of trial and error that we received in the garage when somebody's jumping into this really heavy production environment on day 1? And so we're learning some new little tricks that we can do. And the bread that we baked off this morning was clearly a little bit under fermented. So by pulling it out of the walk-in early, letting it sit out at room temperature for a little while, we're able to give it a substantial final proof. And I'm a lot happier with it now. I think it's going to show in the final bake. So I have 3. I need to score them all a little bit differently. Otherwise, they're all going to look more or less the exact same. So I've come up with 3 distinct scoring patterns for the different loaves. I need a little bit of rice flour. Rice flour makes it easy to differentiate right off the bat because it leaves obvious change in overall tone. The rice flour doesn't really absorb into the loaf It's a great moisture barrier, and as a result, the final loaf still has that lighter tone that comes from the rice flour. So for this buckwheat loaf, I've chosen to go ahead and employ it. Now, we are making this loaf identical to the way that Bakehouse in Ukraine makes their Kyiv buckwheat. In fact, we're calling this a Kyiv buckwheat, and we're using a percentage of the sales to donate to the bakery in Kyiv. And that's part of what we're trying to do in incorporating some of Anna's breads, not only to show people how they're made, but to encourage support for our friends who are facing more extraordinary challenges than we've ever faced. And you know, just in the normal day-to-day of running a bakery, there's plenty of challenges, like, you know, in our case, getting shoved out of our garage and having to make this place in a couple months. So we can relate to just the normal challenges, let alone, you know, challenges that involve war or, you know, that kind of thing, or displacement. So for this buckwheat, I'm going to score it, and you can tell that it's been out for a little while because the dough's soft. So I'm going to score it with 2 parallel cuts. That's going to give it 2 distinct openings on top. And it'll be very easy for us to tell the difference. We're trying a new type of razor too, which I'm not sure that I like as much as the other razor, but I'm giving it a go and seeing how it plays. Let's see if I can even do an ornamental score with it. 2 little wheat stalks on either end. All right, so buckwheat is just about there. I'm gonna grab the other loaves onto the belt, get them scored. We'll score them differently. So I'm taking 3 of my 6 rye. And in this case, I'm not going to use any kind of rice flour, and instead I'm going to score it with an S. It's actually technically a reverse S. So my rye is just a little bit different. Instead of the 2 distinct scores for the buckwheat, I'm doing the S pattern, and so now the people who are selling in the front can just look for the reverse S, and they'll be able to tell the difference. So this half is ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and lift up to my top deck. I'll check my steam settings really quick. Looking good. You can start to understand kind of our challenges with trying to be both an artisan bakery and trying to keep up with our infrastructure. We have to both make a lot of things, but keep the creativity alive. So in our slower summer season, our goal is really quite simple, is how can we get into the food service? How can we do more creative things and not break our efficiencies along the way? So we have a lot of practice to do, but it's going to pay off. My Coruscant loaves are this back 6. The final rye ones are here. This is a sample size rye. So for the Coruscant ones, I'm also going to finish them with the rice flour. Here's the ryes. And now something a little bit different for the Coruscant. In this one, I'm going to differentiate with the ornamental scoring. So I did a wheat stalk from the middle out, and then I flipped it around. I'm doing a wheat stalk in the other direction, and finishing with a nice functional score. All right, so these are all set. I'm gonna add some more steam on this side now. And for the first 15 minutes of this bake with both halves in, I'm gonna trap the steam. So we'll set a timer for 15 minutes, come back and release steam. So Ian, can you tell how the middles are no longer above the ears?
Honestly, which one was it in my bake that was particularly bad?
They were all showing the same signs, but the buckwheat was...
the buckwheat was really out.
Yeah. And it's mostly the scoring on that. Like, that particular scoring pattern will show you under fermentation very heavily. We're talking about fermentation. It's been a big discussion point this morning. I came into the first batch of bread that we made, and this is the buckwheat loaf from this morning. You can see that the center of its crumb is actually taller than the ear to the left. And this is, to me, the telltale sign of under-fermented bread. So it just means this bread needed more time. It needed more time for the microbes to multiply, colonize the dough, and get to work on it. What I'm trying to do now is convey the judgment of fermentation to a team of bakers that, as of just 2 or 3 months ago, were just learning how to mix or just learning how to shape bread for the first time. So this is a difficult thing to learn. It took me a long time to master it on my own. And I don't know that I think master would be the wrong connotation. I think there's still a lot to learn when it comes to fermenting. These are microbes that we're talking about, not very obvious big things. So what I've been showing Ian this morning is the difference in the second bake. I took out the bread from the fridge that was under fermented and let it basically continue proofing at room temperature for a longer period of time. In fact, it was so under bulked that it could be room proofed for a couple hours. And now the final results are no longer the same. You can see, if you look closely, that the centers of these loaves are no longer above the height of the ear. They're rising a little bit more evenly. And so as a result, I imagine the crumb is going to be more open. The loaf will have a greater overall volume because it'll be less dense. There'll be more gases that have built up. And it'll in general impact the texture and flavor in a positive way. So that's our big challenge now, how to bring the judgment of fermentation through to all of our staff that bakes here, so that we don't have to be factory precise in every other way. Because it's either get every single one of the many variables right every single day, or substitute those variables with human knowledge. And the human knowledge is harder earned, but if it's there, it's much more resilient. We can make more adaptations as we go. So that's what we're working on. And I think it's a lot of fun. So the Kiev buckwheat loaves are these right here with this particular scoring pattern. This morning's, this cutout was basically bulging out because there was too much concentrated energy in one part of the dough, namely in the center, and that's what got all the activity in a rise, whereas the edges weren't quite there yet. And the loaves actually came out significantly smaller looking, even though they had the same overall mass. So there's definitely a benefit to getting the judgment of fermentation right. The other thing that we've been playing with is oven parameters. We moved into this facility using the same exact oven parameters that we used in the garage, where we had to set our bottom stone a lot lower than the top heat, otherwise everything burned. Here, we had issues with certain loaves, like getting a little bit too dark on the top. And then we went to Portugal and baked with a bunch of bakers, and they were doing the inverse. The top was set to be a little less powerful than the bottom. So we've been trying it ever since, and I don't know that we have it quite nailed yet, but I'm trying to come up with a more gentle baking cycle in this European oven. So I figured it would work a lot like the ovens that we worked with in Portugal because it's designed nearby. So maybe it has some components that are the same. I'm gonna let them pass and then get these a little darker this time, but we're going to dig into the sample that we already have. Granted, it's a little bit under fermented, you can see the final result and the way it's supposed to look like here. So I'm really happy with this. For me, this is a good redemption because in Portugal, this particular bread was the one that we kind of lost control over. And this one here is exactly what I'm looking for. So really happy with it. And I can't wait to use this to continue to bolster our fundraising efforts for Bakehouse. All right, let's get these set up. So I have all three breads here, except this is from the early bake in the day. These were baked off really early this morning, and we've been sampling them. This is where I noticed that actually they were a little bit under fermented, the buckwheat in particular. You can see how tall the center was. So the ones I just baked are a better overall result, and I'm gonna snag one for my house for later. But we should definitely try this and see how it is. I actually want a piece a little bit more crust. I really like the texture of this loaf with the coarse grains. The buckwheat adds a nice, rich, grainy flavor to the whole thing, but it's not overwhelming. The buckwheat that we made in Portugal, which we thought was kind of our weakest performing dough, had a sharp sour. And I think it was because we lost control of the bulking bin in the middle of the process. So this buckwheat actually has been outselling all of the other ancient grain loaves here at the bakery. Our front of house staff here really loves it, and you know, when you love something, it's that much easier to sell it. We're helping raise funds with it, so there's another goodwill aspect to them. I'm really proud to have Anna's recipe on our menu. I'm proud to call it the Kiev buckwheat, to tie it directly to our bakery. We're making the batons, which Bakehouse has been baking for soldiers and for donation, but this Kiev buckwheat has been on their menu for years. Is a recipe that Anna brought together, and it was after that kind of rich Ukrainian tradition of having buckwheat around as a staple food. When we were together, she was telling us about how she'll come home after a day of work and make her daughter porridge with buckwheat, and that's a comforting food for her whole family. And so making a bread from it and utilizing this grain, which is abundant, I really love that it's not quite a grass, and thus if you grow wheat on a field and you need to rotate that field and give the soil a break, you can plant buckwheat as a cover crop and keep that field moving and still make bread from that cover crop. So I think it's an excellent bread. I'm really pleased to be serving it to Arizonans. It's not a grain that is all that familiar to the people walking through our doors, so I hope people like it as much as I do.